Thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome to you all to the chapel at Pusey House. And I'm going to hand over to Dr. Jonathan Price, who will introduce our speaker. My name is George Westaver. I'm the principal here. Welcome. I'm sorry that it's very dim. I'm sure it's very mystical and helpful to unveil spiritual realities, less helpful to read your paper. I'm going to send around a sign-up sheet if you'd like to receive information about the lectures which take place at Pusey House. An email goes out once a week. Please just add your name and email to this sheet. And Dr. Price will introduce our speaker.
Hello, welcome to Pusey House, or welcome back to Pusey House. I'm glad we chose to do this in the chapel, anticipating throngs to come out to hear about this very, very appropriate topic of Christianity, Christian theology, and the British Constitution, particularly with the monarchy in focus. I'm the lay academic fellow here, and together with Father Mark, Father George, we try to offer an informal Anglo-Catholic chaplaincy, a library of philosophy, theology, patristics, and other things that's open to the public, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and resources that would keep some of the best that's been thought and said and prayed alive. Public theology is something we're trying to do. We have a Center for Theology, Law, and Culture, and Dr. Ritzema is one of our researchers there. Each of the researchers is asked to put on a collegiate colloquium once during their stint, at least, on a topic of their choosing. And so this is something that's come out of John's deep interest in theology with an uppercase T, and his love and preservation of his homeland and some of the character that it has had, and the question of whether some of that character is still plausible in an age that's very different from the time in which that character was constituted. Now, there'll be a manifesto tonight, but don't worry, it's not that kind of manifesto. We would like to do public theology in this register based on some of what Dr. Ritzema says to us over the coming years, allowing various scholars who are with us to continue as part of this as a research program. So if you're interested and if you're keen, do approach Dr. Ritzema or me or Father George afterwards or at a future event. Tomorrow, there's a colloquium that some of you are part of at Christ Church that we're running together with a few partners, including the law faculty, Trinity Forum, Common Sense Society, on this topic, where we're inviting some experts and some persons who are present as inheritors of the Constitution to discuss the possibilities of it, or whether some new model is more appropriate. Now, when I first met John, we were up at Oriel together, and he was referred to me as Mr. Oriel. Now, that was not a title from a beauty contest, although he could win a beauty contest. You know, it wasn't a title from a beauty contest. It's because as far as anyone could remember who was present in our little circles, he'd always been there, right? And what had he been doing there? He'd been doing something that was very typical of Oriel, that is, and what Oriel has blessed Oxford and much of the world with, and that is he was doing theology, straight theology, undergrad, grad, MPhil, and then continued to KCL, where he recently has completed his PhD, dealing with epiphanies in the Hebrew Scriptures. I'm not going to say anything more now, besides that at some point I'm going to pass a donations basket round with no obligation whatsoever. But if you like what we do here, feel free to put something in. And there's a second way you can sign up, which is on this little device for our mailing list, and it's completely direct. And so these baskets will come around, and if you want to make use of them, we'd be very happy. Finally, we have a lecture next week, next Monday, a Recollection lecture. I won't tell you all the information about it now, and next Wednesday. So there's little cards that have full information in the hallway on your way out. Without further ado, Dr. John Ritzema with Christian Theology and the British Constitution, a manifesto for public theology.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you all for being here this afternoon in a slightly dark and slightly chilly chapel. I hope that the temperature will at least keep you all awake for what I've got to say over the next few minutes. I'm going to very dangerously start off by immediately going off-piste and saying that I realised on my way over here that today is the anniversary of the accession of the first Queen Elizabeth. And on this day in 1588, at Hatfield, she received the news that her sister, Queen Mary, had died. And she sank to her knees and prayed the words of the psalm, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes." That's one way of dealing with bad news about a sibling. But it's also illustrative of the way in which this country's constitution, its political history, its monarchy, and its church have been intertwined with the Christian tradition and with Scripture for hundreds of years. And to an extent that remains true even today. I'd like to begin with an additional caveat, which is that I'm not a constitutional lawyer and this isn't a law lecture. I hope I have a decent grasp of the basics, but there are plenty of people, not least in this room, I say with some trepidation, who have a far more sophisticated understanding of the Constitution than I do. One of the reasons that a group of us are, as Jonathan mentioned, meeting at Christchurch tomorrow is precisely to bring together the lawyers and the theologians and some politicians to thrash out the essential features of a conversation on the Christian theological foundations of certain parts of our Constitution. I should also clarify that this lecture and tomorrow's colloquium were timetabled before the sombre events of this September. It had, of course, been clear for some time that there was likely to be a demise of the Crown in the coming years, and that the transition from Her late Majesty to the present Sovereign would both prompt and indeed require some serious thought about the legal, political, cultural, and indeed religious implications of that transition. The colloquium tomorrow was initially conceived of as an attempt to lay some groundwork in the theological and legal worlds in advance of the demise of the Crown, and we have, of course, been overtaken by events. Nevertheless, at the beginning of the new reign and in advance of a coronation, it seems sensible to recalibrate our individual and collective understandings of the relationship between the Constitution, the Crown, the Christian faith, and our wider culture. I'd also like to stress that this ought to be, and indeed must be, a realist project. There's a danger that an articulation of the Christian and monarchical elements of the British Constitution ends up as a kind of aesthetic retreat from modernity, whether at the level of political theology or of one's own active citizenship. A reconsideration and recovery of the Christian foundations of our country and its political system mustn't be a retreat into Ruritanian fantasy. Pageantry might have its place in dignifying the state, but this kingdom's public theology cannot be all ostrich feathers and epaulettes. That would be to sell the tradition short, and it would be an embarrassing abdication of intellectual responsibility. As such, I want to be clear that I consider the Christian and monarchic elements of the British Constitution to be, pretty obviously, part of a much larger whole. Other major principles of the system include the functional supremacy of the House of Commons as underwriting the state's basic democratic legitimacy, the place of an impartial and non-partisan civil service, a commitment to the rights and duties of citizenship, equality before the law, and indeed the rule of law itself. There are movements, largely happily outside this country, which indulge in fantasies of actively reworking the basics of the Western democratic state. And I don't think it's wise or realistic for our public theology to follow them. Another peril is the risk of a kind of royalist or state idolatry. The public and public theologians are pretty aware of the idolatrous potential of totalitarian regimes, of the absolutist demands of fascist or communist politics, which replace God with religious submission to people or party. Less obviously threatening is an improperly ordered reverence for even the constitutional sovereign. Now, various commentators, going back, I think, to Lord Altrincham in the 1950s, have described public attitudes to the monarchy in Britain as verging on a British Shintoism. This is, I suspect, partly a result of a Christian society which has somewhat absent-mindedly largely secularised. In the late Queen's reign, half-remembered religious impulses were channelled into the already sacralised figure of the sovereign. And this is perhaps paralleled by the only semi-coherent ceremonial of remembrance in this country: the poppies, the wreaths, the war memorials, monarch and clergy at the cenotaph, and so on. I don't think that either monarchism or remembrance are bad, but I do think that when unmoored from a clearly articulated public Christianity and from the personal religious belief of some critical mass of the population, they may tend in the direction of idolatry. So with those caveats in mind, I'll get on to the substance of my lecture. To give you a quick roadmap of what's to come, I'll first set out a rough outline of the place of the Crown, which I take to be a basically Christian institution, in the British Constitution. I'll then offer a very brief apology for public theology in the constitutional sphere, setting out the need for that theology to be grounded in the supreme authority of Scripture and the attendant authority of the Christian tradition. And having done that, I'll turn to a few particular passages from the Old Testament, which you hopefully have on handout, which might inform some of our theological reasoning about the relationship between the Constitution, the Crown, and the Christian faith. To give even an outline of the British Constitution is far more than I can achieve in the next few minutes. What I'm offering then is just a few observations. And for those who want a complete account of our system as it currently stands, I recommend Nicholas Barber's 2021 book with AUP, The United Kingdom Constitution, an Introduction, which is what it says on the tin. In terms of fundamental constitutional doctrines, the United Kingdom is still just about that. It remains a unitary state, despite the introduction of devolved legislatures and administrations in Scotland and Wales, and despite the somewhat uneasy settlement in Northern Ireland. Those devolved authorities in the home nations received their legal warrant from the Parliament sitting at Westminster, or lies on the Supreme Court for next Wednesday's judgment on reserved matters. There are 4 home nations, England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and indeed, in some distinct way, a British nation. But the United Kingdom isn't quite a nation-state. It's certainly not the case that in British constitutional theory, there's a legal or explicit doctrine that the state is an emanation of the people. Most modern democracies, following the lead of the Enlightenment republics of the United States and France, have a doctrine of popular sovereignty, where we, the people, underwrites their entire constitutional order. There's admittedly some debate as to whether popular sovereignty is trying to enter the UK constitution by the back door, not least due to the vast cultural influence of America, even upon the legal profession and legal academia, you'll be distraught to hear. But particularly in the wake of the unwise decision of successive British governments to normalise the referendum as a quasi-legislative tool. As it happens, I think popular sovereignty can be a rather sinister doctrine. The people becomes an abstracted, unitary mass rather than an aggregate of actual human beings and our fellow citizens. This abstract people is a little too easily the rallying cry of totalitarianism, and has been since the late 18th century. We saw a dark hint of this, although with a slightly pathetic tone, a few years ago in that 2016 Daily Mail Enemies of the People headline. Further, in a state comprised of 4 home nations, and indeed now home to a huge array of citizens of many different ethnic origins and religious convictions, the doctrine of popular sovereignty threatens to flatten and oversimplify. We remain, like several other modern Western European democracies, a kingdom. Britain is a constitutional monarchy. But while those other states have codified constitutions, basic laws grounded in doctrines of popular sovereignty and the more limited sovereignty of governmental institutions, Britain still retains a whiff of the Ancien Régime. Royal titles, our legal order more generally, and indeed even Britain's coinage, still proclaim that the sovereign here reigns Dei gratia, by the grace of God. This is, of course, a major point of contact between theology and Britain's constitutional order. The King and the Crown are, theoretically at least, the glue that binds our constitutional system together. The Crown legislates in Parliament. His Majesty's government wields the King's executive powers. The courts dispense justice under His Majesty's authority. This royal authority underwrites the whole system and is, theologically and theoretically speaking at least, derived from God. This model belongs to a specifically and historically Christian worldview, in which all authority is derived from God. And it's certainly the case that our particular system provides for a Christian sovereign, a defender of the faith, in communion with the Church of England, anointed and crowned by the established Church. And indeed, the coronation service itself represents and realises a Christian sacramental worldview. Yet it's worth noting in passing that Scripture suggests that all legitimate governmental authority is derived from God. Romans 13 famously argues that this is the case. In the Old Testament, the second Isaiah makes it clear that even pagan kings, like the Persian Cyrus the Great, reign by divine permission and are God's instruments. The king's reigning Dei Gratia is not unqualified. There's a kind of double causation in play. The monarch may be in some theological sense the elect of God, but it's long been established in our constitution that the king and parliament may legislate for the succession. The king reigns by both God's grace and the act of settlement. A king can, in extremis, be deposed by political pressure, although in 1936 the legal formalities were represented by an act of the king and parliament giving effect to Edward VIII's instrument of abdication. The constitution distinguishes, though not always cleanly or clearly, between the person of the king and the crown. One example will suffice here. The monarch is the fount of justice. The courts sit in his name under his authority. Yet it's been established case law since the early Jacobean case of Prohibition Del Roy that the king in his own person cannot adjudge any case. The early modern jurists sometimes relied on quasi-theological reasoning to reach this doctrine, often referred to as the king's two bodies, that is, a body natural and a body politic. Ernst Kantorowicz famously argued that the rulings compiled by Plowden are mystical and theological. When a court ruled that, this is a quote from Plowden, the king has not a body natural distinct and divided by itself from the office and dignity royal, but a body natural and a body politic, together indivisible, and these two bodies are incorporated in one person and make one body and not diverse, that is the body corporate in the body natural, et contra the body natural in the body corporate, etc. It did so using a recognisably Chalcedonian logic. The Elizabethan jurists guard against legal versions of early Christian heresies. Recall Chalcedon, which confessed one and the same Christ, Son, only begotten, acknowledged in two natures, unconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably, the difference of the natures being in no way removed because of the union, but rather the properties of each nature being preserved and concurring into one person and one hypostasis. There's also a theologizing mindset feeding into the English understanding of the crown as a corporation. There's a dual tradition, according to which the crown might be seen either as a corporation sole or a corporation aggregate, with the king as the head of the body politic. Behind the latter in particular lurks St. Paul's teaching on the members of the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians. Indeed, there's some attraction to a theologized understanding of the crown as a corporation aggregate. We might then conceive of the wider public authority encompassed by the crown being to some degree indirectly consecrated to God in the person of the anointed sovereign. It also has the advantage of providing a model for thinking about how public powers are separated in their exercise in a country which has no long-standing tradition of a formal separation of powers. Turning to the legal world, Parliament, that is the king in Parliament, for our Parliament is tripartite, composed of Commons, Peers and the monarch, is sovereign. And broadly speaking, this means that whatever Parliament enacts is law. Parliament's legal sovereignty concerns the relationship between the legislature and the courts, while subordinate legislation, such as statutory instruments, are challengeable in the courts. Acts of Parliament are beyond the authority of judges to scrutinise. It's also broadly true that the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty means that the Parliament cannot bind its successors. Acts of Parliament cannot entrench themselves. Although there's some dispute, and I'm aware that there are lots of lawyers in the room, as to whether the European Communities Act 1972 qualified this doctrine. And it also seems likely to me that parliaments did indeed bind their successors in legislating away any right to make law for former British dominions, for example in the Canada Act 1982 and the Australia Act 1986. But that's a debate for another day. In the executive sphere, His Majesty's government relies in large part on the prerogative powers of the sovereign. These are the King's traditional legal powers, largely now exercised upon the formal advice of a ministry politically accountable to the House of Commons. To quote a judgment from the beginning of this century, itself citing Sir William Wade, prerogative is, properly speaking, legal power which appertains to the Crown, but not to its subjects. And these prerogative powers have been the source of serious legal and political controversy in the last few years, not least the Crown's prerogative power to conduct foreign affairs, see Miller 1, and to prorogue Parliament, see Miller 2. By prerogative, the sovereign appoints ministers, dissolves Parliament, and grants royal assent to laws. They show the Crown and the person of the monarch to be a working, rather than purely decorative element of the constitution. Even beyond the formal legal powers of the crown, the monarch plays a role in the political constitution. First, he has a representative, symbolic function representing the country, past, present and future, to itself and abroad. He is in a symbolic, as well as in a legal sense, constitutive of the United Kingdom. The monarch may be non-partisan, but he's certainly not apolitical. His role is to some extent to embody the polis. But in practical terms, the monarch wields significant influence. We won't for some time know how much personal influence was wielded by the late Queen, particularly in her weekly private audiences with her prime ministers, but political matters are very much on the table in these meetings. We do know, for example, that George VI appears to have exercised direct influence on the appointment of Ernest Bevin as Foreign Secretary in the 1945 Attlee government. Kenneth Rose, writing in the 1980s, hinted at how the late Queen exercised similar influence in the ecclesiastical sphere. A quotation. "A dean of St. Paul's Cathedral once asked the Queen what she could do if a Prime Minister submitted a name for an ecclesiastical appointment with which she was not happy. 'Nothing constitutionally,' she replied, 'but I can always say that I should like more information. That is an indication that the Prime Minister would not miss.'" Rose claimed that the Queen exercised this informal influence in the ecclesiastical sphere at least twice in the middle of her reign. He was writing in the 1980s. While the monarch never rejects formal prime ministerial advice, it is possible for the sovereign to exercise quiet influence to prevent objectionable advice being given to him in the first place, by means of queries, stalling tactics, warnings, and objections, delivered either in confidential audience or via his private secretary. The late Queen's influence seems to have been particularly felt in Commonwealth affairs. James Callaghan went on record as saying that the Queen's encouragement, quote, tipped the scales in how he dealt with Rhodesia as Foreign Secretary in 1976. Now, you may or may not find this sort of influence objectionable, but I explain it to show that all this talk of monarchy matters. The King certainly does not rule this country, but neither is he a purely ceremonial figurehead. I'd finally like to say something briefly about theology and the common law. We've already seen that the courts sit under the King's authority, and we shall shortly hear that the Old Testament seems sometimes to envisage a judicial role as the essential feature of kingship. There further seems to be a connection between the prerogative and the common law. There's a strand of thought in English legal history that the development of Anglo-Saxon and early English law is particularly coloured by Christian theology. Patrick Wormald notes that the particular and explicit example, as a quote, example of God's holy people, i.e. ancient Israel and Judah, is the development, its role in the development of royal judicial responsibility in early England. And he gives the example of Alfred the Great's Doom Book as an epitome of God's covenant with the people to whom he had given lowland Britain. Legal material is interspersed with homilies by St. Wulfstan in such books. Of the common law, John Woo wrote, "It was Christian from the very beginning of its history." Let me offer an extremely brief apology for the project of public political theology in the first place, in 6 theses. 1. The Christian theologian is committed to the claim that Christ is sovereign over all things, including all human societies, legal systems, etc. Therefore, the Christian theologian must give a theological account relating Christ's sovereignty to all such particular things. 2. In the case of the British Constitution, there are, as we've seen, already points of contact between Christian religion and the legal and constitutional order. The public theologian may therefore provide some explanation of how the legal and constitutional order may be understood to cohere with wider Christian theology more generally. 3. Even in purely historical, contingent terms, the history of the British state is rooted in a Christian worldview and has developed in the context of a Christian worldview. As recently as the abdication crisis in the 1930s, understanding the operation of the Constitution required a sensitivity to the place of the Church and the Christian faith in national life. 4. The subsequent development of a multi-faith society within this historic Christian framework makes public theological engagement with legal, constitutional and social structures more, not less, vital and relevant. And I contend that the United Kingdom is rather better at integrating religious minorities than secular Republican France. And I think that the established church, the monarchy, and public theology more broadly have played a role in achieving that. 5. The overarching framework of Christian theology and the Christian moral worldview is not only a historical influence on the development of the present system, but could also be a significant safeguard against future challenges. Our lifetimes are likely to see climate crisis, immense pressure from climate-driven mass immigration, further democratic backsliding, and the further erosion of post-Christian social, cultural, and moral norms. The fragility of liberal democracy, of a healthy and inclusive national identity, and of modern human rights doctrines can and should be protected by A, the long-standing and durable institutions this country has built up over her long history, and B, by a theologically informed and persuasive account of the God-given dignity of each and every human being, without exception, which necessarily underpins the fundamental moral rights of our fellow citizens and foreigners alike. Finally, 6. In the broad Catholic tradition, public theology, like all Christian theology, ought to be grounded in the Scriptures, which, interpreted in the Church, are the sure rule and ground of all Christian doctrine. Even if we hold that political theology is of an order far less important than the central dogmas of the Christian faith, and I do hold that, we might consider that Article 6 of the 29 Articles sets out a secondary, related purpose for the deuterocanonical books of the Bible, namely that they are, quote, read for ensample of life and instruction of manners. At the very least, Christian public theology should be grounded in the God-given instructive examples of the Bible's varied books. Having set out the basic premise then, that a Christian public theology of the Constitution ought to be grounded in a reading of Scripture, I'll turn to 3 biblical texts particularly pertinent to the political setup we have in modern Britain. They're on your handout. Before diving into those, though, I will make a few general observations about theologies of state and monarchic sovereignty in the Old Testament. First, Christian political theology will acknowledge, as Oliver O'Donovan so thoroughly sets out in his Desire of the Nations, the doctrine of the sovereignty of God. Adonai Malak, the Lord reigns, is the repeated confession of the so-called enthronement psalms, which further acclaim the Lord as, quote, a great God and a great King above all gods. Indeed, God's is the only true sovereignty. All other sovereignties are derivative, given, perhaps participatory. Thus, the divine wisdom can declaim in Proverbs 8, by me kings reign, and the prophet Daniel can ascribe to God the power to depose kings and set up kings. In Jeremiah 18, God claims the authority to destroy any nation or kingdom and to build or plant any nation or kingdom respectively. As the psalm says, God is king of all the earth. Second, though, we should also note that the language of sovereignty and kingship in the Semitic languages of the Iron Age Levant doesn't necessarily map onto the post-Westphalian notion of sovereignty. When the Bible speaks of a king or a kingdom, there is some leeway as to what precisely is envisaged. In an article discussing inscriptions of the Iron Age Syrian king, Hazael of Damascus, Matthew J. Suriano assesses Hazael's claim in the Tel Dan and Zakur inscriptions to have defeated a total of 70 kings. He concludes that the old Aramaic Malak, king, cognate with the Hebrew for king Melech, has a semantic range which included minor tribal chieftains and the vassals of other more powerful kings. It's just a reminder that ancient states don't function quite like modern states. Thus, we might bear in mind that discussion of kings and sovereignty in the Old Testament ought to be qualified both by a Christian theological recognition of the ultimate sovereignty of God and by an awareness of the elasticity of some of the Hebrew Bible's political terminology. With regard to kingship in Israel and Judah, the Old Testament offers a spectrum of theological opinions. Some texts, particularly the so-called royal psalms, exhibit the characteristic common political theology of the ancient Near East. Kings are the sons of God, or the gods. representatives of their divine wills on earth. So Psalm 2, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son, this day have I begotten you. Psalm 45, apparently celebrating a royal wedding, addresses the king thusly. Your throne, O God, endures forever and ever. The king is addressed as God. Your royal scepter is a scepter of equity. You love righteousness and hate wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. And naturally, much of this language is taken up by the New Testament in recognizing Christ as God's son as well as David's. Other texts, reflecting disillusionment with the religious and political failings of Judah's historical monarchy, and cognizant of the doctrine of the Lord's own proper sovereignty, take a decidedly dim view of monarchy in Israel. 1 Samuel 8 portrays the elders of Israel demanding that the prophet Samuel appoint for them a king such as the other nations have. The strongly disapproving narrative portrays the monarchy as a revolt against the Lord's own kingship. They have rejected me from being king over them, as well as a rejection of Israelite exceptionalism, a preference for the implicit jus gentium over and against the Mosaic covenant. God instructs Samuel to inform the Israelites as to all the different ways in which a king will abuse his position over them, highlighting the dangers of royal militarism and avarice, and yet he ultimately relents and commands Samuel to give them the monarch they desire. This particular anti-monarchic streak has of course been a firm foundation for Christian republicanism. We might note as valid the warnings about royal absolutism. We might nevertheless construe them as warnings against political absolutism in general. Furthermore, we might ask whether the theological reasoning implicit in this anti-monarchic episode is proper to Israel. In other words, is the problem with the elders of Israel requesting a king, A, that kingship in general is detrimental to the sovereignty of God, or B, that the Lord has some particular sovereignty over Israel? 1 Samuel 8:8 links the elders' demand to a pattern of apostasy against the Lord since the exodus from Egypt. It may be that Israel's particular loyalty is meant to be grounded in that liberatory experience, as appears to be the case in the first commandment in Exodus 20. Likewise, it may reflect the rather ancient belief, located and partially obscured by the Masoretic text in Deuteronomy 32, that Israel, uniquely among the nations of the world, was allotted to the Lord as his own particular portion. Suffice it to say, I don't think that such a relationship of national divine election, exclusive of the constitutionally monarchic form of government, exists in the United Kingdom. We are not Israel. I, of course, concede that the Church and individual Christians possess a citizenship in heaven, as Paul says, and observe that the letter to the Hebrews says of the Old Testament saints that they confess that they were strangers and foreigners here on earth, desiring a better country, a heavenly one. Political claims of allegiance are for the Church and for individual Christians secondary to the new covenant and to our baptismal promises. Nevertheless, Romans 13 establishes the basic authority of legitimate states, and 1 Peter 2:17 enjoins us to both fear God and to honour the King. I turn then to the first of my three major Old Testament texts, particularly relevant to the British situation. First is on your handout. The so-called law of the king in Deuteronomy 17:14-20 is the only explicit provision for a monarchic Israelite polity in the Pentateuch. Importantly for our purposes today, it both affirms the legitimacy of the kingship and sets strict limits upon it. It would be anachronistic to describe this as a constitutional monarchy in the modern sense, but there are some clear points of contact. It stands, to speak in very generalised terms, between the traditions I've just discussed, between the king as an almost divine being on the one hand and the illegitimacy of Israelite monarchy in 1 Samuel 8 on the other. It reads as follows: When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled it, you will say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set over you a king whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your own brothers you will set as king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law written for him in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall remain with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, diligently observing all the words of this law and these statutes, to do them, that his heart be not lifted up above his brothers, nor turning aside from the commandment either to right or to left, so that he and his descendants may reign long over his kingdom in Israel. There are several features to this passage that we might want to draw out for our public theology. First, both state and monarchic sovereignty are in the Lord's gift, but they're not quite coterminous. The Lord gives Israel the land for their possession and settlement, and he likewise chooses the king. The mechanism of this choosing isn't specified. In the case of the Deuteronomistic history, the history books of the Old Testament, kings may be elected directly by God, as is the case of Saul and David, not to mention Jehu. The latter two are specifically chosen by the Lord as he intervenes to depose the reigning king. The extent to which the historian, the biblical historian, positively endorses dynastic succession is decidedly ambiguous. Indeed, a few years ago, David Lamb argued that the Deuteronomist's judgment on this question is strongly negative. It should also be noted that another significant institution is subject to the Lord's choice in Deuteronomy, namely the place where the Lord will choose to cause his name to dwell, that is the temple in Jerusalem. And the verb is used, I think, 6 or 7 times in Deuteronomy 12. This is rather striking, as the centralization of worship at this chosen place is perhaps the central theological concern of the book of Deuteronomy. It perhaps suggests that the kingship is regarded as somehow similarly indispensable, a necessary feature of the Lord's provision for Israel. Reasoning from the connection between monarch and Mount Zion in Psalm 2, Gordon McConville goes as far as to argue that in Deuteronomy, quote, king and holy place are celebrated as symbols of God's love of Israel. Now this might go a little too far, flattening ideological differences between the royal Psalms and Deuteronomy, but in the language of divine choosing, an analogous theological warrant for Judah's kingship is provided. The selection of the king in Deuteronomy 17 is, however, from a twofold principle. Alongside God's choice of the king, he's requested and set up by Israel. It may be that here we're dealing with coexisting constitutional doctrines. Walter Dietrich and Daniel Fleming have each proposed that the northern kingdom of Israel, in contradistinction to the southern kingdom of Judah, may have had a more collaborative politics in which the king depended on the support of significant landholders. I'm a little sceptical of our ability to separate northern and southern traditions quite like this, but Mark Brett has recently noted that whereas David is quite perfunctorily anointed as king of Judah by the people of Judah in 2 Samuel 2:4, just happens, in 2 Samuel 5:3, he cuts a covenant, that is, he makes a treaty or contract with the elders of Israel before he's anointed king over Israel, the north, at Hebron. The king must therefore be one from among your own brothers, that is, an Israelite. Now, it may be that the text here wants to stress the human, mortal nature of the king, but its primary purpose does seem to be national or ethnic. The king's not to be a foreigner. We'll come back to this shortly. Practical limits are put on the king's power. He's not to have many wives. While this seems aimed to prevent the religious influence of foreign wives, such as occurs with Solomon's many brides or with Ahab's marriage to the Baal-worshipping Jezebel, this is also a constraint on the king's ability to contract a multitude of dynastic alliances with foreign powers. The prohibition of amassing cavalry forces limits the king's capacity for offensive as opposed to defensive warfare, and limits on royal economic rapaciousness are fairly self-explanatory. The king is rather to be guided by the daily study of a copy of this law, perhaps an early version of our Deuteronomy, under the watchful eye of the Levites. There's a hint here of the restraining power of cultic politics. Provision for the temple cult in Deuteronomy already raises the profile of the Levites compared to their status in other Old Testament books, Here we see a further consolidation of political influence in their hands. So far, so interesting the implicit analogy with modern constitutional monarchy. But it's worth noting that there's a significant hermeneutical problem with the Deuteronomic law of the king. It doesn't seem to be particularly known, or indeed observed, within the historical books of the Old Testament, in 1st or 2nd Kings. Furthermore, historians tend to date the core of the book of Deuteronomy to the 7th century BC. And this is partly on the basis of the narrative in 2 Kings 22 of the finding of a book of the law in the temple in the reign of King Josiah, in the second half of the 7th century. Josiah's religious reforms in 2 Kings bear a strong resemblance to the centralizing and anti-idolatrous program of Deuteronomy, and since the early 19th century, scholars have been tempted to identify this found book of the law with an early version of Deuteronomy. A further datum is the resemblance of significant elements in Deuteronomy to treaties concluded between 7th century Assyrian kings and their vassals. We know these from the archaeological record, and in the 7th century, Judah was one such vassal state. The list of curses in Deuteronomy 28 bears more than a passing similarity to the curses enumerated in Assyrian vassal treaties. Likewise, injunctions such as, "You shall love Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, as yourself," strongly resemble, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul," etc. It is likely that Deuteronomy is, in general, a subversion or reapplication of the Assyrian political ideology propagated by the treaties, transformed into Judahite theology. The king of Assyria may be Judah's earthly suzerain, but God is its true Lord. Recently, noting that while Deuteronomy's reform program resembles Josiah's religious policy, its law of the king does not resemble Josiah's robust assertion of royal power over the Judahite state. Scholars like Bernard Levinson and Geoffrey Stackett have argued that the core of Deuteronomy dates to earlier in the 7th century BC, likely to the reign of King Manasseh. Remembered by the Old Testament for theological reasons as a wicked king, Manasseh was, in historical fact, a successful politician due to his policy of loyal submission to the Assyrian superpower. Levinson and Stackett each suggest that dating the core of Deuteronomy to Manasseh's reign resituates its text in relation to the monarchy. Rather than receiving the monarchy's endorsement or even emerging from it, Stackett says, as many had supposed was the case with Josiah's temple book, Deuteronomy can be understood as a response to Manasseh's cooperation with Assyrian imperial power. And relatedly, the Israeli scholar Nili Vazana has argued that Deuteronomy's law of the king is an even more directly anti-Assyrian text. The requirement that the king be a native Israelite is aimed at the prospect of direct rule from Assyria. Prohibitions on offensive military capabilities, the multiple wives required for complex dynastic geopolitics, and the excessive accumulation of wealth are thus aimed at imperial, not domestic, policy. Now, whether we read the law of the king as part of a Judahite reform program in Josiah's reign, an internal Judahite critique of Manasseh's regime, or as anti-Assyrian propaganda, we ought to note that this biblical text, which we might consider relevant to our own Christian public theology, comes already laden with significant political and theological commitments. It situates the legitimacy of Judahite royal rule within a wider theological context of monotheism and religious reform. Alive to both the great historical gap between the 7th century Judahite political situation and our own, yet aware of the potential of so pregnant a scriptural text for our own public theology of the British Constitution, what points of contact can we discern here? First, the double criterion of legitimate Deuteronomic kingship, that is, divine election and the desire or consent of the people, speaks to our Constitution, mixed in its institutions, the Crown and Parliament, and its justifying ideologies, the king who reigns Dei Gratia, but also according to Parliament's statutory provisions for the succession and the need for democratic legitimacy, etc. Clearly, the former political theology, monarchy with divine approbation, is not incompatible with the need for popular consent or for firm limits on the Crown's power. In other words, the Christian can affirm kingship by the grace of God without thinking that synonymous with absolutism. The particular limits placed on the Deuteronomic monarch are not dissimilar to those placed on the Crown here. They're practical limits. placed on the military powers of the Crown, in this country by means of Parliament's annual Armed Forces Acts. The money-raising powers of the Crown are constrained by the House of Commons, and in the case of the King himself, by the Sovereign Grant. The Deuteronomic King's obligation to study and keep this law is mirrored by the clear constitutional boundaries placed around the exercise of the Crown's powers by the common law, by statute, by political convention, and indeed the specifically ecclesiastical constraints imposed on the monarch in his accession and coronation oaths. The King's being subject to law, and his power bounded by it, is of course reflected in the case of proclamations, and I imagine that the Deuteronomists would have approved of Edward Coke ruling that the King hath no prerogative but that which the law of the land allows him. We might even indulge ourselves by noting a passing similarity between those watchful Levitical priests in Deuteronomy 17 and the Lord Spiritual who sit in Parliament, or those prelates who belong to His Majesty's Privy Council. Would that they were Levites. We might want to reflect on whether or how establishment is able to, or can be made to, exercise the kind of restraining influence Deuteronomy envisages for the Levites, particularly in a democracy. We might also wonder whether Deuteronomy 17's apparent wariness about the King's capacity to wage offensive war or conduct dynastic diplomacy ought to feed into contemporary debates about whether a convention is emerging, or indeed ought to emerge, regarding the Crown's prerogative powers to make war. That's food for thought for the vast set of people who are concerned with both Old Testament theology and Britain's 21st century constitution. Next on your handout, I'll turn to the political theology that we found in the book of Ezekiel, in particular the texts that you've got there, all taken from the temple vision, which concludes the book in Ezekiel 40 to 48. I also realise that time is marching on, so I'm going to be as quick as I can. Strong criticism of the Judahite monarchy and its policies, and indeed of foreign monarchies, runs throughout the whole book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is capable of being both scathing and subversive. In Ezekiel 19, for example, the prophet transforms traditional royal imagery of the lion to accuse Judah's most recent kings of being lion cubs, growing up with a taste for blood, becoming predators which devour human beings. Royal imagery is given a polemical twist again in Ezekiel 34, in an oracle against the shepherds of Israel. The so-called shepherds are accused of feeding themselves to the detriment of their flock and of allowing their sheep to be preyed upon. The passage could conceivably be about the ruling classes of Judah in general, but Madhavi Nevada has convincingly argued that the ubiquity of the metaphor shepherd is king makes a royal subject much more likely. Ezekiel's not entirely negative about royalty. Twice he promises the restoration of the house of David, though in both instances the restored Davidic figurehead is to be firmly subject to the sovereignty of the Lord. It's worth noting a major terminological shift in Ezekiel. Ezekiel, by and large, insists on using the term Nazi, prince, for Judah's rulers, and indeed for the rulers of the other petty Levantine states. Melech, the Hebrew Bible's usual word for king, is almost entirely restricted to the superpowers, to Babylon and Egypt. And while commentators are divided as to the precise significance of this downgrade, they do largely agree that it is a demotion. This brings us to the vision of the temple and nation restored after the exile in Ezekiel 40 to 48. The prophet is carried away in a divine vision to a high mountain where he sees both a capital city and a sanctuary for the Lord. But all is not quite as one would initially expect. There's no sign of Mount Zion. The city is no longer Jerusalem, and the temple and the city appear to have been distanced from one another. No longer is the temple a royal chapel on the Jerusalem Acropolis. Now it is the central institution of a restored Israel. As Nevada puts it, the nation has changed from a city-state to a temple state. There is, however, as you see on your handout, still a monarch in this utopian visionary Israel. No longer is he as the king, however, but is referred to as Nazi, prince, throughout. And neither is he referred to as David or Davidic. The prince, who is allotted land in the second Ezekiel quotation on your handout, is not to interfere with the land holdings of the Israelite tribal groups. He's to put away violence and oppression, and to execute justice and righteousness, mishpat v'zedekah. And this, at least, is the traditional language of the administration of royal justice. One might recall that the basic function of the king demanded in 1 Samuel 8, which we mentioned a few minutes ago, is to judge us, l'shaftein. The Nazi in Ezekiel's temple vision is largely, however, a cultic functionary. The great unique privilege he's accorded in Ezekiel 44 is access to the outer eastern gate of the sanctuary. This is the Lord's own entrance to the temple, and it's the prince's prerogative to sit there and eat bread before the Lord. Perhaps this is more impressive than it initially sounds to modern ears. The prince has access to the temple beyond any other layman, and permission to eat before God recalls the Sinai theophany in Exodus 24, in which Moses, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, and the elders are privileged to eat and drink in the presence of God on the mountain. Ezekiel 46 explains at some length the sacrifices that the prince is to provide for the Lord at the restored temple. It appears that the prince will be afforded the honour of standing nearby as they're offered and prostrating himself at the threshold of the temple court, though the actual work of sacrificial worship belongs properly to the priesthood. Ezekiel's temple vision is a significant reorientation of both the theology and state ideology of pre-exilic Judah. The Lord is no longer what he sometimes might in practice have been during the years of the Judahite monarchy, the domesticated tutelary deity of the royal house. Instead, the prince is now the domesticated servant of the Lord in his cultural and his cultic establishment. While there's some debate amongst scholars as to whether Ezekiel's Nazi has been reduced to a purely ceremonial figurehead, he's certainly no longer the political prime mover that the pre-exilic king was. That he remains at all is perhaps testimony to the stridently monarchic worldview of the ancient Levant. The prince might be lowered, but not utterly removed from the Israelite constitution. What can our public theology learn from Ezekiel's political vision? The book of Ezekiel is often described as radically theocentric. Perhaps in the first instance we might reflect on a properly ordered public theology. All theology must be directed first and foremost to the knowledge and worship of God, with political theology serving to work out that primary aim within the earthly sphere of human social structures. Ezekiel offers the precise opposite of an Erastian vision. And so we ought to be careful that a Christian public theology which seeks to provide some theological understanding of our constitutional monarchy doesn't simply serve to aggrandize or obsequiously justify that monarchy, or indeed our wider constitution. Ezekiel's political vision is a tonic against state idolatry. Secondly, without necessarily accepting the premise that Ezekiel's Nazi has been reduced to a merely ceremonial figurehead, nor indeed that that has happened to our own sovereign, we might reconsider how we frame the religious significance of a king whose role has been reconfigured into one of symbolic or representative divine service. This to me seems to be a considerably more attractive vision of how the king might relate to the Church of England, for example, or the Church more generally, than the old Tudor supremacy. The monarch as chief patron of the Church and as chief lay worshipper might be more cohesive with the biblical and Catholic tradition than some Erastian alternatives. This shift of emphasis would place a higher premium on the monarch's quasi-priestly role of both privately praying for the nation and of representing the nation in public worship. It might lend itself to a particularly high view of the upcoming coronation, for example, as consecrating our present king to what is now an inherently religious office. Final text. I said earlier that I wanted to offer a realist manifesto for public theology. True to my word, I now turn to a text which might help us to connect high theologies of king and crown to the actual workings of government. Isaiah 22, verses 15 to 25, is focused not on the king of Judah, but on the agents of royal government. It's an oracle against one Shebna, the steward or master of the royal household, that is more or less the king's chief minister. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, it's sometimes the Sofer, the scribe or secretary, who served as the king's chief minister. The 8th century prophet Isaiah ben Amos was an inspired and strident moralizer, but his morality sometimes has a rather patrician tone. The oracle against Shebna seems above all to take issue with the king's minister as a shameless social climber. Shebna, unlike most governmental figures in the Old Testament, is identified by no patronymic. Contrast the next paragraph, where we meet his successor Eliakim ben Hilkiah, Eliakim son of Hilkiah. Shebna is a parvenu. According to Isaiah's oracle, the Lord is incensed by Shebna's pride, and in particular with his having prepared for himself an inappropriately grand tomb, perhaps as if he himself were royalty. It may also be that Shebna pursued the dangerous anti-Assyrian foreign policy of an Egyptian alliance, which elsewhere attacks Isaiah's virulent condemnation. Joseph Blenkinsop suggests that this might explain why the prophet's attack on Shebna is quite so vicious. The punishment of an ignominious death in exile seems somewhat disproportionate to the purported offence of having a slightly fancy gravesite. Shebna is to be replaced by Eliakim. The Lord calling him his servant is language usually reserved for kings or prophets. Further, calling him a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the house of Judah is likewise rather exalted. Blenkinsop traces the language of political fatherhood to the court of the pharaohs. The key of the house of David seems to be a symbol of investiture, signifying authority over the palace, and the language of opening and shutting clearly connotes some serious political authority. It's certainly exalted enough to serve as the type of the ecclesial authority given to Peter in Matthew 16, and indeed, when Christologized, supplies us with the Advent antiphon of Clavis David. It's interesting to note that Isaiah suggests that there's a kind of dual causation going on in Judahite politics. The position of the chief minister is clearly in the gift of the king, hence of the house of David, much as the prime minister in this country receives his legal authority from our king and implicitly, morally, politically, from the House of Commons. And yet the same office is clearly also in the gift of the Lord. God seems to be able to intervene providentially in Judahite domestic politics. Not only does the Lord make it clear that he'll replace Shebna with Eliakim, note that the Lord will call his servant Eliakim, but both Shebna and Eliakim are subject to the Lord's own judgment. Shebna will be pulled down from his post, Eliakim will be cut down and fall. It's perhaps oddly reassuring to us to see the sudden collapse of ministries so familiar to us, described and justified in Scripture. What can we take from this foray into Judahite sub-monarchical politics? First, we can see that ancient Judah, like our United Kingdom, has a model of ministerial authority. The God-given authority of the king is capable of delegation to ministers. Yet Isaiah 22 suggests that God-given authority does not become secularized by such delegation. God remains the sovereign of history, and the sacred figure of an elect and anointed king does not exclude political ministers from contact with the divine, nor shield them from the judgment of heaven. A Christian public theology in the United Kingdom may well recognize, indeed should recognize, the consecrated nature of the sovereign's office, as solemnized by the Christian rites of coronation, but this cannot confine theological concerns to the monarchy itself, or the single person of the monarch. Put bluntly, while in a modern democracy it's entirely sensible that the religious responsibilities of the state should fall on the shoulders of a necessarily Christian king, thereby allowing adherents of all faiths and none to wield practical political power, Mr. Sunak and other politicians nevertheless remain well within the purview of Christian public theology. I'm aware that I'm probably going over time, so I hope you found this account of points of contact between theology and the Constitution useful. You more or less stayed awake, along with my justifying reasons for public theology and those particular scriptural case studies. Aware that the Church's lex credendi is shaped by her lex orandi, I'll close then with the prayer book's prayer for the King's Majesty. O Lord, our Heavenly Father, high and mighty King of kings, Lord of lords, the only ruler of princes, who dost from thy throne behold all the dwellers upon earth, most heartily we beseech thee with thy favour to behold our most gracious sovereign Lord, King Charles, and so replenish him with the grace of thy Holy Spirit, that he may always incline to thy will and walk in thy way. Endue him plenteously with heavenly gifts. Grant him in health and wealth long to live. Strengthen him that he may vanquish and overcome all his enemies, and finally, after this life, he may attain everlasting joy and felicity. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. Thank you.
So we have 15 minutes-ish until we need to clear this, so I'm going to suggest that we take questions. I'll ask anyone who has a question to put their hand up, and then John will respond to all of them, not at once, but after the questions are done. So probably if there are 5 short questions. I saw Robert, and then Michael, Father George. Are there 2 more? It's your shot. Okay, we'll do these 3 to start with. So, Robert Jackson, would you like to?
I always thought there was a bit of a religion in the second verse of the national anthem. But thank you very, very, very much for drawing our attention to the neutralistic policies of may he defend our laws and always give us cause to sing the part of the voice of our Saviour King.
Thank you, I really enjoyed that talk. I want to maybe push back a little bit on the point you made. Maybe you want to have a slightly more realist take on this, because I think towards the end of the talk there, you potentially switch back into something that's slightly less realist, because the constitutional settlement that we have here now that splits the constitution between dignified and efficient, I think seems to quite rightly point to your account, put almost all, if not all, of the religious Christian aspects of the Constitution into a spiritual head that is, for most practical purposes, impotent. And so I wonder then, to what extent can you then say that this is still within the context of the efficient side of the Constitution, Christian in any deeper meaningful sense? Has this all just collapsed into a symbolic, dignified aspect of the Constitution?
Father George.
Thanks again, John. That was fascinating. I wonder if you could say a bit more about, I think it was your 4th point, about the way in which the development of a multi-faith society doesn't make Christian public theology less but more significant, and that would seem paradoxical, at least in some light. And if you could say why you think that the development of a multi-faith society in some way makes this a more significant undertaking.
Thank you. In the meantime, I'll say that. Okay. Why don't we have Paul? Yeah, let's.
What do you think about the title Defender of the Faith, and particularly in light of your suggestion that the role of the chief lay for the church could be a more appropriate way of
Perhaps should I jump in at this point? That's quite a few questions for me to deal with. Thank you. They're all very interesting. I'll start with Father George's question. I think the development of this country into a multi-faith society, first of all, necessitates that we start to show our working. So if there's a lot of Christian implicit reasoning going on in at least how this country has evolved, and to a lesser but still present extent to how it operates today, how it navigates that inheritance, having a large number of citizens who not only don't share that faith, but come from entirely different backgrounds, it's probably necessary that we drag that stuff out into the open. And I would say that even if I weren't a public theologian, if I were entirely secular, secular historian or something, I would think that we would need to be a lot more explicit about that sort of thing in order for a significant chunk of our fellow citizens to have an understanding of where we've come from and where we're going. I also think that Christians and members of other religions sometimes understand one another rather better than liberal secularists do. And so I think we need to push back against this liberal fantasy of there being a generic category of religion. And far too much public discourse concerns religion in society, religion in law, religion in politics, etc. And if you're a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or whatever, that's not a particularly helpful category. And if I were a Muslim or a Jew or whatever, I would want to see the explicit Christian working that gets people into the political positions they hold and the cultural politics that they might advance. And so that's why I think public theology is more important now than maybe it was a couple of generations ago. Going back to Michael's question about a realist project and whether the dignified and efficient sides of the Constitution have been totally separated. First of all, I'll confess that I don't really like Bagehot. He's a liberal Whiggish journalist, and that's just about the worst thing I'm willing to say about the person in the house of God. So I might just reject the premise. However, I also recognise that, you know, the operative political constitution of this country has been influenced by Bagehot, and he's now a canonical text, if not an authority. Discussing the way that the monarch can exercise indirect influence, I think, shows that that barrier is permeable. And so while the monarch in his official and formal capacity very much is dignified, according to Bagehot's definition, that network of influence and whispers and private politics, which clearly goes on behind closed doors and should go on behind closed doors in any functioning, complicated society, suggests that the barrier isn't total. I'd also like to push back against the idea that that which is dignified or symbolic isn't or can't be efficient. So St. Paul in the letter to the Galatians says that the law is a pedagogue. And he's talking there, of course, about the Torah, and he's talking about the Torah in salvation history and in the church. But I think that's true of law in general, right? And you know, there are people here who know far more jurisprudence than I do. But the formal legal doctrines that a country sets out, particularly in its constitutional arrangements, have an informative and pedagogical and culture-shaping function. And even if the monarchy and even if the Christian elements of the constitution were reduced to the purely dignified in Bagehotian terms, that would still make them influential. And a realist account of political theology would still want to take them into account. Robert, I'm delighted that you've accused the national anthem of being Whiggish. But yes, I think the recognition that the sovereign has a responsibility to defend laws, defend the social and legal systems under which we live, rather than reshaping them arbitrarily at will, points to a conservative, small c conservative function of any political constitution, which is to stop trends towards dissolution and chaos. And that if we think about the monarch's perhaps purely symbolic role, even that is important, and we should indeed consider the national anthem a genuine prayer that functions that way. And finally, Paul, you asked about the title Defender of Faith. It's always been a complicated and ambiguous title ever since it was conferred on Henry VIII and then re-granted by Parliament to Edward VI. Defender of Faith versus of the Faith, I don't think they're mutually incompatible, and I think the present king has made it clear that he intends to be both. He has certainly publicly said all the right things about being a committed Christian and member of the Church of England, and I find it extremely unlikely that we're going to see any significant constitutional change in the present reign. I'm perhaps more sceptical and pessimistic about the future after that. But also I think it is worth noting, as I was mentioning, I think we do things in some ways better than our French cousins. I think the current king has had huge leeway as Prince of Wales to make his stance very clear on everything from anti-Semitism in this country and Western Europe. During the height of the scandal about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, he very publicly and unofficially, insofar as the Prince of Wales could do anything unofficial, hosted engagements for the British Jewish community in Buckingham Palace, which sent out a very clear signal as to where the non-partisan but political establishment stood on that question. I think that was good and important. Likewise, he's been very good on the persecution of Christians in the Middle East, etc., etc. And so I hope that he will be both the formal defender of the faith and a defender of faith in general, and that's a good thing.
So we can probably sneak. Oh, I think this has now been. Jack, you did. I think we have no sound guy. I think we only have time for David Campanellis at this point, and a quick response from John. You just need to speak loudly, please. Is it working? Oh, I'm sorry.
It is. So I'm not a theologian or an academic. I am, at least I think I still am, a monarchy candidate. I just want to observe that I think that this lecture and this series are a great gift, a prophetic opportunity, and I really use that word carefully. Because I'm minded of the Gospel account in Matthew 12, 43-45, where Jesus talks about the Spirit roaming in the desert because he'd been cast out and had no place to go because the house had been swept clean. And he went back and thought, well, I'll go back there. And he took 7 of his mates with him. And Jesus says, so it is with this generation. And I want to ask for your comment on the great urgency of this project, because I think you've actually undersold it. The gift that is Europe and Christian civilization is not a given. We have to show our workings out. And are we not witnessing the spirits roaming the desert that is now Europe and our country? Because they've swept out the Christian gift that is common law and our constitution, or at least seeking to do that. And unless we replace this gift that we have, as it's been interpreted through generations of politicians and Christians, certainly in Parliament, then are we not doing anything other than inviting the 7 spirits to inhabit this house that we have just vacated?
I completely agree. Despite my usual cheery disposition, I'm actually quite pessimistic about the future. I think the pressures that this country and the other Western democracies will face in the course of my lifetime are going to be immense. And we shouldn't take for granted liberal democracy, human rights, all of that sort of stuff. And I do think public theology has a role to play in defending, but also reshaping those things to be more sustainable, less vulnerable, more humane in the future. I completely agree about the sort of ideological threat of de-Christianization and secularism, which you're talking about. If people hate or are afraid of the silly things that right-wing or left-wing politics have done in the last century under a broadly Christian dispensation, then you should just see what's coming, right? Because the post-Christian right and the post-Christian left are much, much scarier. And I think anything that we can do to boost our society's immune system in preparation for that threat which is coming is salutary. And whether it's in theology, in the church, whether it's in other academic disciplines or in the wider world, I think there's a huge amount of work to be done on that front because the challenge is bearing down on us.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for this wonderful introduction to our collegiate colloquia and ask everyone else to as well. And just before I do, we will have evening prayer, a sung evensong, not by a choir, but by those who participate, that anyone is welcome to attend just beyond the wall here from 12:30. Father George.
Do you want to mention our next 2 lectures? Because they're not disconnected with our subject today.
Yes, I would like to get them correct though, which is possible because I have this sheet, which you too could also have a copy of, just on your way out in the hallway. On Monday, we have Father Joseph Hamilton, who will be speaking on what is it, Sincere? It's not actually on this list, is it? Cyprian, on Cyprian, and on the role of prophecy in the early North African church.
We'll almost certainly connect with the because we'll almost certainly be about demonology as well.
Well, he always talks about demonology. No matter what he's talking about, it always goes to demonology, which is one of the reasons he's so popular. The Inferno is the most popular part of Dante, and demonology is the most popular thing about Father Joseph. And then And yeah, don't tell him I said so. You can watch it on YouTube. And then on Wednesday, Ralph Weir, who's a contemporary analytic theologian who is actually a dualist and large believer in the soul, is going to come and give us In Defense of the Soul, where he's going to ask, what's all the fuss about? Isn't the soul a pretty good account of who we really are? And that will be Wednesday. The Monday lecture is later at 6:15. The Wednesday lecture is at the normal Recollection time. That is 3:15 for tea with the speaker upstairs and 4 o'clock to begin. And we welcome you to come to both of those. And to view this online and send it to friends in the future. It'll be up on YouTube. It's been live streamed, and it'll be up on YouTube as of, I should say, next week. And we'd encourage you to share it with friends and have them join up with this project and help us do this at the Center for Theology, Law and Culture. So thank you, Dr. Ritzema, for this wonderful and engaging lecture.